Man, Jacobo Grinberg. Why do we live in a society where if a woman decides to live alone, without a partner, without a man by her side, she is immediately singled out, judged, or considered incomplete? Why does it seem that simply being single is interpreted as a defect, a flaw, or something that needs to be fixed? This view not only limits the woman's freedom, but also places her in a position where autonomy is questioned and happiness is measured by external standards. But what lies behind this rigid and prejudiced social outlook? Why is being alone seen as a lack rather than a valid choice? This phenomenon has deep cultural and psychic roots that determine how our beliefs and values about women, love, and couple life are built. In this video, we will explore this reality and its causes, guided by an unconventional but revolutionary perspective, that of Jacobo Grinberg, a consciousness researcher who invites us to look beyond the apparent. What did Jacobo Grinberg discover about perception and consciousness? And how does this relate to the woman who lives without a partner? Jacobo Grinberg, a Mexican psychologist and neurophysiologist, dedicated much of his life to studying the nature of perception and human consciousness. His approach was not limited to traditional neurology, but integrated ancestral knowledge and spiritual practices, proposing that the reality we experience is nothing more than a personal and collective construction. According to Grinberg, perception is not a passive reflection of the world, but an active process where our mind creates the forms and meanings we accept as truth. So, what happens with social perception toward the woman who lives alone? If reality is a construction, that negative view judging the woman without a partner is not an absolute truth, but an interpretation conditioned by deep-rooted beliefs. Collective consciousness, influenced by myths, prejudices, and cultural mandates, holds the idea that the complete woman is the one who has a man by her side. This social construction acts as a parallel reality that, however, profoundly affects the experience and well-being of many women. Grinberg invites us to question that construction, to awaken from limited perception, and to recognize that there is a multiplicity of realities and ways of existing. Understanding this is key to comprehending the transformative strength represented by the woman who chooses to live alone, free from imposed emotional and social chains. The myth of the incomplete woman who needs a man to feel whole is not new. It has been reinforced for centuries by cultural, religious, and social narratives that present women as dependent beings, whose main purpose is to complement a man, form a family, and attend to others' needs. This narrative has generated deep emotional dependence, where female identity is defined by relation to the other, not from the self. This emotional dependence has multiple consequences. It generates insecurity, fear of loneliness, anxiety for social approval, and a constant external search for validation. The woman who lives alone directly challenges this myth because she shows herself as a self-sufficient being, capable of finding meaning, love, and fulfillment within herself. However, that same autonomy makes her a target of criticism, misunderstanding, and sometimes social rejection. Breaking with this myth involves a process of personal and collective deconstruction. It is necessary to question limiting beliefs, open spaces for dialogue, and recognize the value and dignity of the woman as a complete being herself, with rights and capacities beyond traditional roles. If at any point you have felt that being alone without a partner makes you less valuable, less happy, or incomplete, I invite you to stay with me until the end of this video. Here you will find perspective that challenges those myths and opens a path toward emotional freedom, self-knowledge, and deep acceptance of who you are. This will not only change how you see yourself, but also transform your relationship with the world and those around you. Because living alone is not a lack, but an act of courage, authenticity, and power. Let's discover that truth together. Since ancient times, the figure of woman has been shaped by myths, legends, religious norms, family customs, and social structures that have built a collective image full of symbolism, control, and expectations. Among these constructions, one of the most persistent and limiting is the belief that a woman needs a man to be complete. This idea, passed down generation after generation, has penetrated so deeply into the collective unconscious that often it acts invisibly, like an unquestionable truth that governs behaviors, choices, and self-perceptions without us even being aware of it. But where does this myth of female emotional dependence arise from? What cultural roots feed it? And why has it held so much power through the centuries? To understand it, it is first necessary to take a journey through the history of civilizations and the stories that have defined gender roles. In most traditional cultures, the role of woman has been linked to the domestic sphere, child-rearing, care, and above all, subordination. From the earliest tribal structures to monarchical societies, passing through religious empires and medieval codes of conduct, the woman was placed as a secondary figure, dependent on the male, both economically and spiritually. This hierarchy was justified through mythologies that assigned to men strength, rationality, and power, while women were attributed emotion, fragility, and obedience. The result: an image of woman as an incomplete being, needing to be guided, protected, or possessed by a man to have value or purpose. Religious texts played a key role in solidifying this narrative. In many traditions, such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the foundational story presents woman as derived from man, literally formed from his rib, and responsible for humanity's fall. This symbolism is not minor. Not only does woman appear as secondary in origin, but also as dangerous, capable of diverting man from his spiritual path. Eve, for example, is portrayed as the one who disobeys, tempts, and drags Adam into sin. This kind of story creates an interpretive framework from which woman is seen as a being needing surveillance, control, and ultimately a male guardian. In classical philosophy, these ideas can also be traced. Plato and Aristotle, two pillars of Western thought, offered views of soul and body, placing woman in a position of inferiority. For Aristotle, woman was a kind of incomplete man, lacking the same rational capacity, subject to emotional fluctuations, and thus less fit for public, political, or intellectual life. This conception was replicated for centuries in educational, religious, and family institutions, shaping a culture where woman's voice was silenced and her freedom restricted. Moving toward the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the female figure splits between two extremes: the virgin and the sinner, the pure, obedient, submissive virgin dedicated to the service of others, and the fallen woman, sexually active, disobedient, dangerous. In both cases, woman is boxed into a role not chosen, but imposed. Both figures need an other to define them, a man to save them, redeem them, or punish them. This duality has generated a deep psychological burden that many women, even today, still carry with the arrival of modernity. Although important changes in women's rights and possibilities occurred, the myth of emotional dependence did not disappear. It transformed, adapted, and disguised itself. 19th century romantic literature and 20th century cinema helped perpetuate the idea that romantic love was the ultimate female destiny. Fairy tales, period novels, and Hollywood movies popularized the narrative of the other half, the Prince Charming, the love that cures all. In these stories, the female protagonist is usually incomplete, sad, trapped, or lost until man appears or returns her joy, purpose, stability, and of course, eternal happiness. This type of narrative became ingrained in mass culture and became the aspirational model for many generations. Being loved by a man was equivalent to being valuable. Having a stable partner was a sign of personal success. In contrast, not having a partner was cause for concern, suspicion, or ridicule. Thus, the woman who lived alone began to be seen as strange, bitter, demanding, difficult, or even a failure. This view, although based on stereotypes, remains alive in multiple family, media, and even institutional discourses. The weight of this cultural construction is not limited to the symbolic, but has concrete consequences in women's lives. Many grow up with the idea that their personal fulfillment depends on finding a partner. From very young, they are taught to please, to take care, to be desirable, to compete among themselves for male attention. They are inculcated that their time is valuable depending on the interest they generate, and that aging without a man is a sign that something went wrong. This emotional pedagogy limits their freedom, reduces their self-esteem, and generates constant anxiety about meeting expectations they often do not even desire. The patriarchal narrative has been particularly skilled at disguising itself as romanticism. It has made us believe that emotional dependence is love, that jealousy is passion, that possessiveness is care. It has sold the idea that total surrender to the other is virtue, and that prioritizing oneself is selfishness. Under this logic, the woman who lives alone and takes care of herself, who needs no one to feel well, becomes a threat to the established order. Her existence shows that a full life is possible without fulfilling the romantic mandate, and this is deeply disruptive for a culture based on the idea of hierarchical complementarity. Furthermore, this narrative has generated a kind of identity void. Many women, when left alone, feel they have lost a part of themselves, not because they decided from desire, but because they were educated to define themselves through the other. The breakup of a relationship or the conscious choice to live alone can then be experienced as a crisis, not so much due to loneliness itself, but because of the questioning it generates in their identity. Who am I if I am not the girlfriend, the wife, the mother, the caregiver, the lover? These questions are a direct product of a culture that has historically denied the value of the autonomous woman, the self-sufficient woman, the woman who suffices for herself. Today, although feminist discourse has succeeded in making many of these cultural traps visible, the myth of emotional dependence remains present, especially in environments where patriarchy still has a strong hold. The idea that a woman without a partner is alone, empty, or waiting for something remains a common lens through which she is seen, judged, and often limited. This deeply unjust vision needs to be dismantled not only from critical thought, but also from lived experience. Because every woman who chooses to live alone, not out of resignation but freedom, is challenging that structure, telling another story, inhabiting another paradigm. And that new paradigm needs no justification or permission, because true love, the love that transforms, begins first with oneself. To deeply understand why the myth of emotional dependence has been so persistent, even in an era where autonomy discourse seems more present than ever, it is necessary to turn to a deeper vision of consciousness and perception of reality. Here is where Jacobo Grinberg's work is revealing. This Mexican neurophysiologist and psychologist proposed a theory that completely changes how we understand what we call reality. According to Grinberg, there is no objective reality independent of us, but a self-induced reality born from the interaction between our internal neural field and what he called the lattice or universal consciousness mesh. This means what we see, feel, and believe about the world and others is not a direct reflection of what is, but a personal construction based on our beliefs, cultural conditioning, emotions, and previous experiences. In this sense, perception becomes a filter through which we interpret every event in our life. What for one person may seem freedom, for another may be abandonment. What for one woman may be fulfillment, for another may be emptiness. And this perception does not arise from nowhere. It is shaped since childhood by a whole symbolic framework that teaches us how to see, what to think, and how to feel. Grinberg affirmed that this perception field builds like a matrix, and that collective matrix, fed by language, media, education, and relationships, ends up generating a shared reality that is not necessarily true, but does have real effects on our behavior and emotions. In other words, if an entire society has been trained to think that a woman without a partner is incomplete, then that will be the emotional reality imposed, even for those women who do not fully believe it. Because even if unconsciously rejected, the way the collective perception affects their self-esteem, decisions, and way of relating to others. This is the deepest root of the myth of emotional dependence. It is not just a story told, but a perceptual reality imposed, reproduced, and reinforced from many fronts. Advertising, cinema, textbooks, popular songs, family comments, peer pressure, social judgment. Everything articulates to sustain the idea that the single woman is lacking, that something is missing, that she must seek something. And when that perception becomes norm, rejection soon appears. Here enters the first major conflict faced by the woman, who decides to live alone: social rejection. This rejection can take many forms, sometimes explicit and direct. Family members insinuating it's about time to find a partner, co-workers seeing her as too independent, acquaintances allowing themselves to comment on her life with phrases like, "Will you get married?" or "You must be very difficult if no one can stand you." Other times rejection is subtler, disguised as concern or humor, but with the same judgmental load. "You can afford those luxuries because you have no one. Don't you feel lonely at night? Surely you were hurt." These kinds of remarks are not only invasive, but reflect a deep social discomfort toward the woman, who does not follow the expected script. It is as if her mere presence triggers a kind of collective alarm saying, "This shouldn't be this way." And indeed, the woman alone, especially if at peace with herself, represents a dissonance in the system. She is the crack in the structure, the living proof that other ways of being in the world exist, other ways to love, grow, feel, live. And that unsettles because it questions the norm. And everything that questions the established order usually meets rejection. But this rejection is not always external. Often the woman herself, even when she has chosen to be alone, faces internal voices that sabotage her, whispering she is not enough, that something is wrong with her. These voices echo cultural conditioning. They are the result of growing up in a society that taught her value is measured by how much she pleases, how much she accompanies, how much she gives, not by how well she knows, cares for, and affirms herself. That is why even the strongest, most conscious, and determined women may go through moments of doubt, sadness, and questioning, because it is not only a rational choice, but a deep emotional process involving reconstructing oneself from different places. In this context, the environment also plays a fundamental role. Many women who decide to live alone report a shrinking social circle, a kind of progressive isolation. Some friends drift away because they no longer share the same topics or feel there is something strange about that choice. Others, even with good intentions, try to intervene in her effective life as if it were a problem solved. Support networks become scarce, and in some cases, chosen solitude turns into imposed loneliness due to the discomfort their choice causes others. This isolation is not only unjust but deeply revealing. It shows that social rejection is not only toward the woman who lives alone, but toward what she represents. Because she embodies a possibility of a non-dependent existence, a feminine being who needs no justification, who is not defined by a romantic bond, who does not revolve around another, and that, in a culture that has glorified love as the only destiny, is almost revolutionary. That is why, many times, the path of the solitary woman is not easy. It is not because it involves breaking deeply rooted structures. It is not because it requires inner strength that is not always present at first. It is not because there are moments when external misunderstanding cuts deep. But it is also a path of discovery, growth, and truth, because to the extent a woman holds firm in her choice, she becomes a reference for others. To the extent she does not give in to fear or pressure, she creates a new narrative, freer, more authentic, more human. And in that process, consciousness expands. Perception transforms. What once seemed a lack begins to reveal itself as a brave choice. What once was loneliness becomes sacred space. What once hurt as rejection begins to heal as freedom. Because, as Grinberg said, reality is not something imposed on us from outside, but something we weave with our decisions, beliefs, and acts of awareness. And every woman who decides to inhabit herself, without asking permission or waiting for approval, is creating a new way of seeing and being, a way where emotional dependence no longer fits, and where solitude stops being a punishment to become a sanctuary. For centuries, solitude has been understood as absence, as emptiness, as a kind of existential abyss to be avoided at all costs. In a culture where noise, constant company, social networks, affective bonds, and nonstop activities have become synonyms for full life, silence and distance have grown suspicious. Being alone has shifted from a common human experience to an uncomfortable label. But what if in that silence there were a door? What if what we have called solitude was actually a deeper form of meeting ourselves? From contemporary psychology to ancient spiritual traditions, solitude has been explored from multiple dimensions, all agreeing on one point. It is not about being without others, but learning to be with oneself. This nuance is fundamental, because one thing is forced isolation, the kind that hurts, weighs, alienates. And quite another is interiorly accepted solitude, the one that nourishes, reveals, transforms. The difference lies in the awareness with which one inhabits that space. In psychology, various studies have shown that personal development, emotional self-regulation, creativity, and a deep sense of identity cultivate more solidly in moments where the individual has time and space for themselves. Solitude, far from being a threat, functions as an incubator of integrity. It is a scenario where the superficial layers of self begin to shed, where social roles fade momentarily, and what remains is a bare essence without adornments, masks, or the need to please. When lived from this perspective, solitude becomes a silent teacher. It teaches us to listen to what we usually silence. It confronts us with our contradictions, with unresolved wounds, with inner dialogues we tend to avoid out of fear or habit. And within that confrontation, a great opportunity hides as well. To see ourselves as we truly are, without filters, without distractions, without the noise of others' opinions. Just ourselves and our inner reflection. And that is the first step toward emotional freedom. Carl Jung, one of the great references of deep psychology, said that he who looks outward dreams, but he who looks inward awakens. That phrase precisely summarizes what solitude represents when faced with courage, an awakening, but not a sudden, anxious, or forceful awakening, rather a gentle, progressive awakening, where we rediscover ourselves in layers. It is in solitude where we understand our true desires, not inherited or imposed ones, but those born from the very center of the soul. It is also there where we can heal wounds, integrate broken parts, reconcile with our stories. However, this process is neither immediate nor easy. At first, many people experience fear, anxiety, even resistance, because being alone implies confronting everything that external noise helps cover up. Insecurities, dark thoughts, old beliefs, emotional voids, guilt, nostalgia, unanswered questions. Solitude acts as an honest mirror. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It shows you what truly is. And that can be uncomfortable, but it is also deeply healing. From a therapeutic viewpoint, it is known that processes of individuation and personal growth require times of introspection. It is impossible to know oneself without stopping. It is impossible to mature emotionally without listening to one's own emotions. It is impossible to heal without validating what is felt, even if it hurts. And for all that, solitude is necessary, not as punishment, but as vital need. Just as the body needs rest to regenerate, the psyche needs moments of retreat to integrate. But beyond the psychological, there is a spiritual dimension of solitude that many cultures have known how to honor. In Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism and Taoism, withdrawing from the world for certain periods is not seen as odd, but as a fundamental practice for soul growth. Silence, contemplation, disconnection from noise, and connection with inner nature are considered paths toward wisdom. Even in early Christianity, desert monks voluntarily withdrew from society to meet God in solitude. They did not do so out of disdain for the world, but out of love for the truth that dwells deep within being. And solitude, when lived with awareness, connects us to something greater than ourselves. It reminds us that we are not alone, but accompanied by an invisible dimension often forgotten amid routine. It may be divinity, intuition, universal energy, the soul, or simply the mystery that inhabits us. But it is there, waiting to be heard. Solitude opens space for that encounter. A space where nothing needs to be pretended, where no performance is demanded, where no judgment exists, where all we feel is valid and can be embraced. From this perspective, solitude is not absence, but full presence, not emptiness, but depth, not punishment, but possibility. Yet we live in a culture that has made constant company an almost addictive need. We are taught that being alone is dangerous, sad, or problematic, that silence is suspicious, that if you don't share every moment with someone, something is wrong. But that narrative completely ignores the transformative value of chosen solitude lived from respect. Often, solitude is feared because it is associated with abandonment, failure, or rejection. But that fear does not come from solitude itself, but from the ideas we have built around it. If from childhood we have been taught that spending time alone is a way to nourish, know, and care for ourselves, we would probably live it with more peace. But if solitude only appears in discourses as a synonym for loss or romantic failure, it is logical to live it with anguish. It is necessary, then, to re-signify solitude, to dismantle the story that associates it with suffering and begin to see it as a fertile space, as land where new versions of ourselves are sown, as a sacred parenthesis where everything is ordered, because it is in that space where the mind calms, the body rests, the soul speaks. And if we manage to make peace with that space, everything else begins to find its place. Solitude, when accepted with love, transforms. It becomes an ally, refuge, teacher, medicine. Not because it cures everything, but because it prepares us to live from a place more real, more genuine, more whole. And that is priceless, because a woman who has learned to be alone, a woman who knows herself, cares for herself, listens to herself, is a free woman, free from mandates, free from fear of being with herself, free from relationships that do not nourish her, free from depending on others to validate herself. That freedom is not built in company. It is built in intimacy with oneself. And that is precisely what well-lived solitude offers. The possibility of coming home, inhabiting oneself, choosing oneself. There is a moment in many women's lives when solitude stops feeling like an accident and begins to be assumed as a choice. It is not a sudden turn nor a decision made from logic. It is rather an internal feeling that matures over time, a certainty that settles in body and mind. I can be alone, and that is okay. Not only is it okay, it is powerful. Because when a woman chooses to be alone, she does not do it from abandonment but from freedom. And that changes everything. Chosen solitude is not passive, not resignation nor escape. It is a radical affirmation of one's own being. It is looking life straight in the eye and saying, today I choose myself. Today I don't need to fill voids with others' presences. Today my voice, my body, my silences, my home, my thoughts are enough. It is a declaration interrupting the cultural script that dictates a woman is incomplete without someone by her side. It is resisting the idea that one validates oneself with a couple, romantic love, the we as the only source of meaning. When a woman decides to stay in her own company and build her center there, she accesses a dimension of power very different from what is usually shown in the external world. It is not a power shouted, flaunted, or imposed. It is a power felt, sustained, radiated without need for explanation. It is a strength born from not needing applause, not fearing judgment, walking at her own pace, choosing whom to be with not from lack but fullness. This kind of power is not easily taught because it does not fit social success molds. It does not appear in movies as a happy ending. It is not measured in likes, status, or visible achievements, but it is reflected in how a woman cares for herself, how she talks to herself, in the decisions she makes, in what she doesn't tolerate, in what she no longer negotiates. It shows in her posture, her calm gaze, her way of inhabiting time and space without anxiety. It is the power of one who no longer chases, who no longer needs to be chosen to feel valuable. And this power can only flourish in solitude, because there the wheel of others' expectation stops, external noises dissolve, the necessary emptiness is created so something new may be born. It is in solitude where the woman begins to hear her own voice, not the one repeating mandates nor seeking approval, but the authentic voice, the one knowing her longings, limits, shadows, light. That voice needs space. It needs silence. It needs time. And that is what chosen solitude gives. The impact of this process is not only internal. When a woman stands from that strength, her environment changes. She no longer connects from need, but from desire. She no longer seeks to be completed, but accompanied. She no longer tolerates lukewarm, manipulative, or dependent relationships. She no longer lets herself be dragged by urgency to fill spaces, because she has discovered her inner space is enough, and that gives her a clarity and autonomy she didn't know before. Solitude has taught her to return to herself, and from there, everything else arranges with greater coherence. This experience of solitude as empowerment does not mean isolation, nor denial of love or bonds. It is not rejection of relationality, but a redefinition. It is about choosing from a more conscious place, where connection with others is not anesthesia against emptiness, but a complement to one's own fullness. It is loving without losing oneself, sharing without merging, being without depending. And that way of relating is only possible once the process of being with oneself has been traversed, without masks, urgencies, or emotional crutches. At this point, Jacobo Grinberg's vision offers a deeply illuminating perspective. For him, the reality we live is not outside us, but within. There is no objective world separate from our consciousness, but a field of information organized according to our mind's internal structure. Grinberg called this field the lattice, a quantum consciousness network where all possibilities exist, but each human projects their own version of reality based on what they carry inside. This means external experience is a reflection, a manifestation, a mirror of our inner landscape. From this view, solitude is not an external fact, but an experience that originates and transforms within. It is not something that happens to us, but something we create, interpret, and re-signify according to the state of our consciousness. If we see solitude as punishment, abandonment, or lack, it is because there is an internal structure that perceives it so. But if we see it as refuge, a space for creation, a possibility for expansion, then that will be the reality that manifests. Not because things magically change outside, but because our perceptual system has been modified from within. Grinberg insisted that spiritual work is not outward, but inward. That true transformation does not occur in the visible, but in the invisible. And in that sense, chosen solitude becomes a sacred laboratory, a space where consciousness sharpens, perception clears, distortions reveal themselves. In solitude, being without another's distraction, a woman can observe more clearly the patterns she repeats, wounds not healed, beliefs that limit her. And upon seeing them, she can begin to transform them. This process is deeply spiritual because it touches the very core of being. It is not about an exercise of self-esteem or superficial independence, but a reconnection with the internal center, that center that does not depend on others' recognition, that does not need to fulfill roles to feel alive, that is not governed by external successes. It is a place where personal truth dwells, the one that cannot be explained but is felt clearly when all else fades. For Grinberg, that center is the point of contact with the divine, not as an external God, but as a dimension of wholeness accessed only when the mind's noise ceases. And it is precisely in solitude where that access is facilitated, because the external world stops pulling, masks fall, defenses relax, and an inner silence appears. A silence that is not emptiness, but fullness. A silence that is not scary, but peace. A silence that reveals the sacredness of being alive, present, conscious. When a woman enters contact with that space, she never looks the same again, because she has discovered that her worth does not depend on any external circumstance, because she has felt firsthand that her inner world is vaster than any landscape she has seen, because she has understood that the truest love is not that which comes from outside, but that which is cultivated inside, with patience, tenderness, presence. And that understanding is not intellectual, but experiential. It is felt in the body, in the breath, in the gaze, and it transforms everything. Solitude then ceases to be waiting time and becomes revelation time, no longer a parenthesis between relationships, but a sacred journey to the self, a journey not all dare to take, but those who do never forget, because what is found there resembles nothing the external world can offer. It is freedom, peace, power. It is the certainty that the sacred is not far, not in the future, not in another body, nor another story. The sacred is in oneself, and it begins to reveal itself just when everything seems to have stopped. From childhood, even before understanding what love means, we are emotionally educated through a very specific narrative, the romantic ideal. And although no one teaches it formally, it slips into every corner of our childhood. In animated movies, bedtime stories, songs we hum without fully understanding, in the dialogues of soap operas we watch at dinner. Love, we are told, is the center of everything. Romantic love, couple love, the love that comes to save us, complete us, give us meaning. One main source of this emotional education is cinema, especially Disney films and other children's productions. Just recall a bit. From the first princesses like Snow White, Cinderella, or Sleeping Beauty, the pattern is the same. A young woman, usually good, beautiful, submissive, and with a painful past, waits unaware she will be rescued by a prince. He appears, almost always without deep character development, simply as a savior figure, and his love, spontaneous and perfect, solves all conflicts. She does not need to know herself or undergo internal transformation. All is solved by finding the other. That is the climax. That is the prize. That is the happy ending. This type of narrative, repeated for decades, unconsciously molds female desire. It leads us to expect someone to come and complete what we feel we lack. To think true love is that which appears unexpectedly and changes everything. That previous suffering is just a prelude to the romantic miracle. That once love arrives, Everything will be fine forever. The message is clear. Your story truly begins when he appears. But these stories, though charming, though often endearing, leave a dangerous mark, because they do not show real self-knowledge processes, nor relationships built on reciprocity, nor complex emotional conflicts resolved with communication and maturity. Everything revolves around the magic of finding someone, not the truth of learning to love oneself and choose consciously. The problem is not the existence of a love story, but that this story is the only one presented as valid or desirable. Over time, cinema diversified, but the core of the romantic ideal remained. In romantic comedies for adults, for example, the script barely varies. A woman, generally successful but with an emotional void, meets a man who, after a series of obstacles, ends up being the love of her life. Even if she is strong, intelligent, and determined, there is always something missing in her life until he appears. In the background, the same idea is sustained. Love is the highest goal. No matter how much you have achieved, if you are not in a relationship, you are incomplete. And if you lost that love, then life stopped. Then it must be recovered. Then everything revolves around that absence. Novels, both literary and soap operas, have further reinforced this vision. For decades, popular stories have centered on suffering for love, jealousy, betrayals, impossible loves that end up becoming possible, and heroines who forgive the unforgivable because they truly love him. Often emotional abuse, dependence, and control are romanticized. It is presented as desirable that someone leaves everything for you, gets jealous, watches you, obsesses. Pain is normalized as part of love. Eternal waiting, self-abandonment, romantic sacrifice as proof of fidelity are legitimized. This narrative construction not only affects what we desire, but also what we tolerate. Many women grow up believing that suffering for love is normal, that feeling constant anxiety for someone is a sign of a special connection, that crying, begging, waiting, and enduring are necessary stages before reaching that movie-like love. Thus, emotional crumbs are accepted, disrespect is minimized, lack of reciprocity is justified. Because if the love model taught to us was drama, sacrifice, struggle for someone who doesn't fully choose us, then the healthy may seem boring. Then calmness can be confused with lack of passion. It is important to say, we are not criticizing the idea of falling in love or building a loving relationship. What we are deconstructing is how inequality, emotional dependence, and personal renunciation have been romanticized in the name of love. How a woman has been placed as a passive protagonist of a story written by another. How our collective imagination has been formed to believe happiness lies on the other side of a relationship, not in the center of oneself. The most paradoxical part of all this is that many times we are not aware of the script we follow. We believe we choose freely. But in reality, we are repeating patterns ingrained in us from very early on. We fall in love with ideas, not people. We project unrealistic expectations, get frustrated when they are unmet, and then feel something is wrong with us. But it is not that something is wrong. It is that we were told an incomplete story. We were taught to dream of a happy ending that depended on someone else. And rarely were we taught to write our own plot. Even when modern discourse tries to break these molds, it often only changes the characters, not the structure. Movies where now the woman saves, the man still reinforce the same logic that someone must be saved. The story still revolves around rescue, redemption, sacrifice. Forms change, but the core remains intact. That is why true deconstruction is not about reversing roles, but questioning the very need to construct our identity based on another. This work is not easy, because it involves reviewing everything we have consumed, believed, desired. It is looking with different eyes at those stories that moved us so much, made us dream, cry, sigh, and saying, "Thank you, but I need something different. I need something more real, more honest, more connected with myself." Because love cannot continue being a fiction that nullifies us, infantilizes us, binds us to impossible ideals. Love has to be a place where we can grow. And for that, first we must dismantle the sandcastles built for us since childhood. This act of dismantling is, in itself, a process of empowerment. It is beginning to see love not as a destiny, but as a possibility, not as a pending debt, but as a conscious choice. And to get there, it takes courage to question, unlearn, look beyond the script. Because only then can we begin to write stories that truly include us, where we are not anyone's waiting, where we do not need someone to rescue us, where there is no prince, no tower, no spell to break. Only us, alive, awake, complete, telling ourselves the story we finally want to inhabit. One of the most repeated and accepted metaphors of love is the famous idea of the better half. We hear it so often in so many contexts that we hardly stop to think about what it really implies. It seems harmless, even sweet. Two halves that seek each other meet, fit perfectly, and form a whole. But behind that apparent sweetness hides a deep, silent, and dangerously limiting trap. Because if we believe we are only half, then we will always be incomplete until someone comes to complete us. We will be lacking. We will be waiting. And worst of all, we will believe our worth is defined by our capacity to fit with another. This concept has sunk so deeply that it has become part of common sense. You haven't found your better half yet. I know there's someone out there who is your other half. We all have someone waiting for us. These phrases, though said with good intention, reinforce the idea that being alone is a temporary state, a mistake to fix, a lack to resolve. And if a woman decides not to look for anyone, or feels complete with herself, then something doesn't fit. Because cultural narrative does not consider the possibility of a woman being whole on her own. The danger is not only in the metaphor, but in how it shapes the way we relate. If we believe the other is our other half, we will inevitably project onto them the responsibility to fill us, heal us, make us feel good. And that is a burden no relationship can sustain without breaking. So, when the idealization falls, as always happens at some point, frustration, emptiness, guilt appear. We feel something failed. Maybe he wasn't the one, and we must find another better half. And so we enter an endless cycle of searching, dissatisfaction, and emotional dependence. Moreover, this view feeds a kind of conditional love, where the relationship is based on how much the other can give and feel good, not on how much we can build from each one's integrity. Love ceases to be an encounter between two whole beings and becomes an emotional transaction. I give you if you give me. I stay if you fill this void. From this logic, any conflict, distance, or disagreement is lived as an existential threat. Because if the other is my half, who am I without them? This model also hinders conscious decision-making. Many women stay in relationships that do not nourish them, that exhaust or even hurt them, simply out of fear of being without their other half. Because if I leave, what am I? Half a person? A fraction of who I was? How do I start again if the story I was told says I'm only whole if I'm with someone? That deeply rooted idea paralyzes. It nullifies personal desire. It silences the inner voice. And that has very concrete consequences. Dissatisfaction, emotional wear, anxiety, self-abandonment. Here appears a second big conflict. The tension between social pressure and inner desire. Because many times, women feel deep inside they want something else. That they need to be alone for a while. That they want to prioritize their personal growth, healing, space, freedom. That they don't want to relate from need, but from choice. But then the outside voice appears. When you're able to settle down, don't be so picky. The train doesn't pass twice. No one wants to be with someone who doesn't need anyone. You're going to end up alone. These comments don't always come with malice, but they carry constant pressure that undermines trust in one's own intuition. The woman in personal growth starts doubting. Am I asking for too much? Do I have a problem? What if time runs out and I regret it? Social pressure becomes a fog that darkens inner clarity, and many end up giving in, not because they truly want to, but because the weight of external expectations becomes unbearable. Family is often one of the most intense sources of that pressure. Grandparents hinting they want great-grandchildren soon, mothers dreaming of seeing their daughter in a white dress, aunts asking at every gathering if there's someone on the horizon yet. Even in progressive circles, where freedom and empowerment are discussed, there's still a kind of discomfort with a woman who, past 30 or 40, remains single. It is as if she is failing an invisible subject, as if she constantly needs to justify herself. I'm focused on my career. The right person hasn't come yet. I haven't had luck. As if it weren't enough simply to say, I'm fine as I am. Pressure also comes from symbolism. In movies, songs, social media, couple love remains a narrative center. All content seems to say a full life is a shared life, that the goal is forever. That validation comes from another's "I choose you." And this not only affects women who are alone, but also those in relationships who feel something doesn't fit. Because if they're following the script but aren't happy, where is the fault? In them? In the other? In the model sold to them? Many don't dare answer those questions because the answer would force changes their environment isn't ready to support. Thus, a painful contradiction perpetuates. Women who long for freedom but feel guilty for desiring it. Women who dream of a more authentic bond but cling to what they have out of fear of judgment. Women who want to be alone for a time but don't know how to defend that decision without seeming cold, selfish, or difficult. Women who have tried so hard to be accepted that they no longer know if what they live is what they want or what is expected of them. This internal conflict is one of the most complex and profound because it touches the core of identity. Who am I beyond what they expect of me? What do I really desire beyond what I'm supposed to want? What do I need to be at peace with myself? These questions have no quick or easy answers. They require silence, introspection, honesty. They require courage to hold a different choice, even if it hurts, even if it's uncomfortable, even if not everyone understands it. Because only when a woman manages to hear her desire above external pressure does she begin to inhabit her truth. And that truth does not always include a partner. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes later, sometimes never. What matters is not the outcome, but the root from which the decision arises. When the decision comes from inner desire, then there is coherence, calm, strength. But when it comes from fear of judgment, desire to fit in, cultural mandate, then there is fracture, noise, emptiness. Recognizing this conflict is the first step to overcome it. Naming it, putting it on the table, stopping pretending nothing happens when in reality we feel we are betraying ourselves. And, above all, beginning to build spaces, internal and collective, where personal desire has value, weight, legitimacy. Spaces where a woman can say, "I want to be alone," without having to explain, justify, or defend herself. Where she can say, "I want to be in a relationship," without falling into old patterns. Where she can simply be what she is, without fear, without guilt, without borrowed scripts. Because only when inner desire frees itself from external pressure does true love arise. A love that doesn't come to complete what's missing, but to share what is already full. And that love, whether with another or oneself, is worth living. If at any point you felt pushed to live a story that wasn't yours, tell me in the comments. Let's create together a space where being a woman does not mean meeting expectations, but living with authenticity. Your experience can inspire others. A woman who chooses to be alone is not only making a personal decision, she is, whether she wants to or not, activating collective discomforts. Her choice does not go unnoticed because in a world where women are expected to define themselves in relation to others, daring to walk alone is seen as disruption. That woman is not only observed, she is projected onto. She becomes, unintentionally, a screen reflecting the fears, judgments, insecurities, and contradictions of society that still doesn't know what to do with her freedom. Since the patriarchal system began organizing social structure, woman has been defined by her relationships. Daughter of, wife of, mother of, not as an autonomous being, but as an extension of someone else. That's why when a woman breaks that narrative and decides to be alone by choice, not because she was left, not because she wasn't found, but because she prefers it, culture shorts out. Her presence interrupts the script. And when the script is interrupted, the system needs to explain, judge, or reject that interruption. The projections cast upon the woman who lives alone are multiple and contradictory. On one hand, she can be seen as too strong, as someone who needs no one, almost a mix of admiration and suspicion. On the other, she is infantilized or victimized. She must have had a bad experience. Surely her heart was broken. She'll get over it. These ideas are not innocent. They arise from the collective attempt to neutralize a figure representing something many still don't understand: the possibility of living without dependence. This female figure, free from traditional labels, forces others to look at their own internal structures. For men, She may be uncomfortable because she doesn't fit the stereotype of an accessible or needy woman for other women. She may confront their own repressed desires, the part of themselves that would also like to be alone but hasn't allowed it. For family, she may cause uncertainty because they don't know how to fit her into the family narrative. There is no mold for her. And what cannot be classified generates anxiety. That anxiety translates into projections. The woman alone then becomes a symbol of what is not understood, what cannot be controlled, what is not fit. Adjectives are projected onto her that function as social defenses: difficult, demanding, selfish, proud, immature, traumatized, unstable, rebellious. These labels do not speak of her, but of those who issue them. They are attempts to rationalize something that exposes an uncomfortable truth. Not all women desire the same. Autonomy is possible. Fulfillment can be built without meeting expected patterns. Culture is not prepared for complexity of this figure. It needs to reduce her to stereotypes. And that is why extreme roles are also assigned. Sometimes she is seen as a kind of solitary heroine, unbreakable, almost dehumanized. Other times as a sad, resentful, incomplete woman. In neither case is she allowed simply to be a person who has chosen a different, valid, legitimate way of life. She has always demanded an explanation, a justification. Why are you alone? Until when? What are you waiting for? Don't you want to be a mother? Don't you want to form a family? Those questions are not real questions. They are disguised judgments. And each reveals a collective incapacity to tolerate what deviates from the norm. Because when a woman decides to be alone, her decision not only affects her, it discomforts those who perhaps never dared ask if their life responds to their own desire or to learned imposition. It discomforts those who chose a partner out of fear of solitude, family pressure, or not knowing how to be with themselves. The woman alone is, unwillingly, a mirror, and not everyone is prepared for what the mirror reflects. That is why many times they try to break her through narrative. She is exposed to discourses seeking to return her to the mold. You'll grow old alone. No one will take care of you when you're old. You're wasting your best years. You'll regret it when you can no longer have children. You'll be left behind. These phrases work as control mechanisms disguised as concern. But what they really say is, don't make us question our choices. Don't challenge the story we have believed all our lives. Because if you can be happy alone, then perhaps our idea of happiness was not as solid as we thought. There's also a deeper symbolic dimension in this figure. The woman who chooses to be alone embodies, in a way, the break from the traditional female archetype. She is no longer the muse who inspires, nor the mother who cares, nor the wife who accompanies. She is an ambiguous, untamable figure who does not offer herself nor adapt, who does not seek to be chosen, who is not built from a need for another. That figure awakens fear, but also fascination, because she represents what cannot be controlled. And what cannot be controlled, in a culture based on hierarchies and fixed roles, is always seen as dangerous. This danger is not real. It is symbolic, but it has real consequences. Because many women who choose to be alone face exclusion, uncomfortable silences, sarcastic comments, looks that don't understand. They feel misunderstood, judged, sometimes even betrayed by other women who, instead of supporting them, criticize them. And that hurts. It hurts because chosen solitude is not emotional isolation. It is a form of freedom seeking authentic connection, not superficial validation. But when the environment does not support, that freedom can become a hard burden to bear. Yet many do. They keep walking, with all the noise around, with all the weight of projections falling on them. They keep walking because they know their path, though lonely sometimes, is true, because they have learned to recognize external voices and distinguish them from their own, because they have chosen a meaningful life, and that, no matter how much it bothers others, is non-negotiable. In this sense, the woman who chooses to be alone fulfills a fundamental role, opening new paths, widening margins, allowing others to see that yes, it is possible. That yes, it is possible to live from authenticity. That yes, it is possible to build a life with purpose without fitting into others' molds. That yes, it is possible to inhabit one's own story without fear of judgment. Her very presence is an act of resistance, transformation, consciousness. And it is not only a life choice, it is a profound symbolic declaration. I don't need to meet your expectations to feel valuable. That phrase, said from experience, from integrity, has immense power because it breaks the circle of emotional dependence, challenges imposed hierarchies, and returns a woman to her place of origin, the center of herself. Jacobo Grinberg was not a conventional scientist. His work challenges the boundaries between psychology, neuroscience, shamanism, and metaphysics. One of his most revolutionary proposals was the integration of the concept of the shadow within the field of collective perception. Although this term originally comes from Carl Jung, Grinberg approaches it from an even more radical perspective. We are not only creators of our individual perception, but also co-authors of collective perception, where unrecognized shadows are projected onto certain subjects, figures, or social symbols. And few figures awaken as much projection as the woman who decides to be alone. For Grinberg, the perceptual field is like a vibratory network that acts as an interface between individual consciousness and a greater consciousness. This network, which he called the lattice, is fed by the information each individual deposits into it. Thoughts, emotions, beliefs, experiences. That is, we do not only perceive the world, but also encode it with our unconscious burdens. When these burdens are not processed or integrated, they become distortions that tint our interpretation of reality. And at the social level, these collective distortions give rise to shadow. That's the repressed, feared, or denied aspects that end up projected onto certain figures, embodying what we do not want to see in ourselves. In this sense, the woman who decides not to submit to traditional mandates, who breaks with the idea of needing a man to validate herself, who lives alone not from bitterness but choice, becomes a privileged recipient of those projections, because she represents what the cultural system has learned to suppress. Female freedom, self-sufficiency, desire not mediated by another, internal power. And since those aspects have been repressed for centuries, in men and women alike, her mere presence activates the collective shadow's projective mechanism. Grinberg maintained that what is not integrated is projected. What is not accepted in oneself is sought outside to point out, reject, or idealize. That is why the woman alone can be seen as a danger or as an ideal, but rarely as a whole human being. Those who have repressed a desire for freedom may see her as too independent. Those who fear their own vulnerability may read her as too cold. Those who never dared set boundaries may label her as too harsh. These readings do not speak of her, but of what the other has failed to integrate. From Grinberg's perspective, the shadow is not negative in itself. It is a call, a map toward what needs to be reconciled. And therefore, people or figures that activate our shadows have a sacred function. They act as portals for self-knowledge. Within this framework, the woman who lives alone becomes a symbol of that internal rupture between what we deeply desire and what culturally we've been told we must be. Her existence reminds us of all we have silenced to fit in, all we have kept silent to please, all we have forgotten about ourselves. Society projects its shadow onto her because it does not know how to deal with her coherence. Because seeing her whole without a partner breaks the emotional equation that says alone equals empty or alone equals failed. Because her choice reveals there are other ways of being, and that forces one to examine one's own. And examining hurts. Questioning is uncomfortable. Recognizing that maybe we have not lived from authenticity, but from fear or habit, is a painful process. That is why, instead of integrating, projection is preferred. Instead of admiring, reduction is preferred. Instead of opening questions, labels are closed. But Grinberg also insisted that the power to transform that shadow lies within each one. That when we stop projecting and begin to look inward, perception clears, sharpens, becomes more real. And in that internal gaze appears the possibility of reconciling with what we deny, of recognizing that what we admire or reject in others is often within ourselves, waiting to be heard, that the freedom we see in another woman also dwells inside us, even if we have not awakened it yet. This process is not merely theoretical. It has deep emotional implications. When a woman is seen from the collective shadow, she carries a symbolic weight that does not belong to her. She is demanded to justify her life, to explain her marital status, to calm others' anxieties with gentle words. And many times, to avoid conflict, she does it. But every time she apologizes for being who she is, every time she softens her truth to not cause discomfort, she is also denying herself. She is yielding part of her power to that projection that was not born in her, but in the collective mind. That is why understanding the shadow phenomenon is not only key to understanding how society sees a woman alone, but also to free her from that unjust burden, to return her the right to be without carrying others' fears. And at the same time, it allows us to look at our own projections. What does this woman make me uncomfortable about? What is her way of being in the world provoking me? What does her freedom, her firmness, her silence tell me about myself? Perhaps, instead of criticizing her, I could learn from her. Perhaps what irritates me is what I myself have not allowed to be. Grinberg spoke of the perceptual field as a mirror, not a physical mirror, but vibratory. Everything we see, everything we feel toward others, everything we interpret is part of that mirror. And the key to awakening, to exit distorted perception, is to recognize the reflection, to see the other not as a threat, but as a teacher, to see discomfort not as something to avoid, but as a clue. Because where there is judgment, there is shadow. And where there is shadow, there is possibility to integrate, heal, expand consciousness. From this perspective, the figure of the woman alone transforms. She is no longer an anomaly, nor a heroine, nor a threat. She is a reflection, a symbol, a catalyst, an opportunity for society to see what it needs to reconcile. The capacity to be with oneself, effective autonomy, the power to say no, the dignity of not fitting in just to fit in. And while that integration does not occur, projection will continue. But every time a woman holds her center, every time she does not yield to guilt, every time she inhabits her choice calmly, she will be helping that collective shadow to dissolve. She will be saying, without words, I am not your fear. I am not your emptiness. I am not your frustration. I am just a woman who chose another path. And my existence is not a threat. It is a possibility. And that living, conscious, and firm possibility is perhaps one of the deepest forms of social transformation, not from conflict, but from coherence, not from rejection, but from integration, not from noise, but from truth. There comes a moment, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, when a woman begins to disconnect from the versions of herself she has sustained for years, not because there is something wrong with those versions, but because they no longer resonate, no longer nurture, no longer represent what she feels inside. It is then when a silent transformation begins, the journey toward the real self, that self that does not respond to what should be, nor to others' desires, nor to cultural mandates, that self that has been patiently waiting to be seen, heard, chosen. But getting there is not automatic. Internal transformation does not occur by reading an inspiring phrase or having a revealing conversation. It is a deep, sometimes painful process that implies unlearning, letting go of roles, dropping masks, and facing uncertainty. Because the real self is not on the surface. It is beneath layers and layers of conditioning formed since childhood. It is hidden between what we were told we should be and what, deep down, we really long to be. Since childhood, many women have been trained to please, adapt, harmonize. They have been taught to put others' needs above their own, to smile even when exhausted, to apologize even when they did nothing wrong, to give in so as not to upset. That way of being in the world molds a functional identity, socially accepted, even admired, but not necessarily authentic. And over time, that distance between what we show and what we feel begins to weigh. The soul starts to demand coherence. There begins the transformation, not as an act of rebellion, but as a vital need. Something inside says enough. Enough of pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Enough of saying yes when we really want to say no. Enough of holding relationships out of fear of being alone. Enough of fitting molds that no longer contain us. Enough of living by external expectations. And that enough is not a crisis. It is an awakening. It is a turning point where the real self begins to make its way. Developing the real self is not about creating a new identity, but remembering the original one, the one that existed before the world told us who we should be, the one that played without guilt, dreamed without limits, expressed without fear, felt without asking permission. Recovering that essence is a deep act of self-love. It is telling oneself, I recognize myself, I honor myself, I allow myself to be. This process requires courage because it involves looking at parts of ourselves we may have avoided for years. It requires sitting with discomfort, going through moments of emptiness, holding uncertainty without rushing to fill it. Because when we drop the masks, there is nothing left to defend us from external judgment. But it is also there where true strength is found, in vulnerability embraced with dignity, in showing oneself as one is, without explanations, without disguises, without the constant fear of not being enough. The real self does not shout. It does not need to prove anything. It is serene, firm, clear. It does not impose, but it also does not hide. It inhabits the body with presence, the word with honesty, and life with responsibility. The real self knows it does not have to please everyone, because it no longer seeks to be chosen, but to choose. And that difference marks a before and after, because when a woman chooses herself, everything around her begins to reorganize. What does not resonate falls away. What does, stays. What limits her moves away. What nourishes her comes closer. And that is not magic. It is the consequence of having made an internal decision to stop living from duty and start living from truth. Along this path, there are many tests. The environment may resist. Old versions of oneself may try to return. Old thoughts may knock again at the door. Am I doing the right thing? What if I'm wrong? What will others think? But the real self does not need certainties to move forward. It only needs coherence. It only needs to listen to itself. It only needs not to betray itself. And if that means walking alone for a while, then it walks alone. But it never returns to the place where its own voice was lost. One of the clearest signs that the real self is awakening is a change in the quality of inner dialogue. Constant criticism begins to transform into care. Judgment becomes understanding. Demand yields to compassion. The woman no longer speaks to herself from harshness, but from respect. She no longer pressures herself to comply, but asks if that makes her happy. She no longer punishes herself for feeling, but allows herself to feel everything without guilt. That transformation in how she treats herself is one of the most radical acts of emotional maturity. And here is where many are surprised, because connecting with her real self, she discovers that fulfillment is not outside. That peace does not depend on having a partner, family, success, or recognition. That what she always sought was in her center. That she did not need to change to be loved, but to love herself to change. That the safest place in the world is not a relationship, nor an achieved goal, nor external validation, but the home she builds within herself. This awakening does not happen just once. It is a continuous, dynamic process. Sometimes it moves forward strongly, other times it recedes a little. There are days of clarity and days of confusion. But as one inhabits herself with more presence, the real self becomes easier to recognize. It is not about perfection, but connection. About returning to oneself each time the world pushes you away. About remembering that your essence is not lost, only dormant, and that you can always return to it. A woman connected with her real self stops asking permission to live. She stops negotiating her boundaries. She stops selling her time, body, energy in exchange for acceptance. She begins to love freely, work with purpose, choose her battles wisely. Not because everything is easy, but because she has understood life is not about fitting in, but expressing fully. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this process is that by developing the real self, many women begin to inspire others, because authenticity inspires. Because seeing someone living her truth reminds us we can live ours too. Because the real self not only transforms the one who inhabits it, but expands an energy that invites others to awaken, without speeches, without impositions, without superiority, just being. And that act alone is already a form of revolution. When a woman has begun to develop her real self, she inevitably enters a process of self-knowledge. But it is not about knowing oneself through external labels, nor summarizing oneself in roles, nor defining oneself by what one does or who accompanies her. This kind of self-knowledge is a journey inward, intimate, patient, where the goal is not to reach an improved version of herself, but to discover what was already there beneath layers of conditioning, fear, and inherited expectations. Knowing oneself deeply is daring to look without filters, not to judge, but to understand. It is accepting that not everything we feel will always be bright, that there are also gray areas, contradictions, doubts. It is embracing emotions without classifying them as good or bad. It is being able to say, "This is me," even when that affirmation makes others uncomfortable or challenges the image we had built. True self-knowledge does not seek to fit in, it seeks to free itself. This process demands honesty. It is not about repeating motivational phrases or convincing oneself that everything is fine. It is about courageously facing what hurts, what we have avoided, what frustrates us. Asking ourselves why we react as we do, where our wounds come from, what parts of us need more care. Many times, this journey reveals emotional lacks we had tried to cover with relationships, work, distractions. But when we stop seeking answers outside, a void appears that, far from being a threat, is the entrance to a new stage. This process involves detachment, not as coldness or indifference, but as an act of emotional maturity. Detachment is the ability to be with someone, something, or an experience without losing oneself in it. It is to love without possessing, to let go without destroying oneself, to say goodbye without collapsing. It is to stop clinging to what no longer resonates with our truth, not because there is no love, but because there is respect for oneself, not because it does not hurt, but because it hurts more to stay where the soul no longer grows. Detachment does not mean closing off from the world, but opening to a new one. It is a decision not to hold on to what must follow its course. It is understanding that there are bonds, stages, ideas, and even versions of ourselves that were necessary but have completed their cycle, that we no longer need to drag what we were to protect ourselves from what we are. That letting go is not giving up. It is trusting. It is giving space to what comes, to who we are now, not to what we once feared losing. When a woman begins to live from conscious detachment, her emotional life changes radically. She no longer seeks to fill herself through another, no longer trades her well-being for company, no longer chains herself to unfulfilled promises. She learns to distinguish between love and dependence, between attachment and commitment, between desire and need. And in that clarity, she begins to build more authentic, freer, more reciprocal bonds, because she no longer loves from emptiness, but from inner abundance. That abundance arises from a different relationship with her emotional world. Many women have been taught to distrust their emotions, that crying is weakness, that anger is dangerous, that showing sensitivity is a sign of instability. But when the process of self-knowledge and detachment is traversed, it is understood that emotions are not obstacles nor enemies, but messages from the soul. They are like waves that come to remind us what we need to look at, attend to, release. And then emotional life is no longer seen as chaos to control, but as a temple to honor. Imagining emotional life as an inner temple transforms the way we relate to what we feel. Instead of avoiding, we inhabit. Instead of repressing, we listen. Instead of judging, we accompany. Every emotion, from joy to rage, from tenderness to fear, has a sacred place in that temple. And by allowing ourselves to feel them with respect and presence, we begin to know ourselves more deeply, more truly, more lovingly. This temple does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be calm all the time. What matters is that it is alive, that it is ours, that we can enter without fear, because that emotional space is where we rest in the mask, where we stop accounting, where we simply are. It is where intuition is brewed, where meaningful decisions awaken, where the most intimate truth is heard. It is their emotional maturity is gestated. And to mature emotionally does not mean not feeling, but feeling everything with more awareness, balance, responsibility. It is moving from impulse to intention, from reaction to discernment, from guilt to understanding. It is being able to hold our emotions without dumping them on another, without justifying everything from pain, without getting stuck in past stories. It is recognizing that, although our wounds explain us, they do not define us, that what we feel matters, but what we do with what we feel matters too. An emotionally mature woman is not one who has stopped suffering, but one who has learned to go through suffering without losing herself. one who allows herself to cry without shame, who can speak of her rage without hurting, who embraces herself in moments of falling without demanding perfection. She is the one who has understood that her emotional life is not a problem to solve, but a map to follow, that what she feels is a compass, not an obstacle, and that every emotion lived with awareness brings her closer to herself. This way of inhabiting the internal world has a direct impact on the external world, because when a woman inhabits her emotional temple with dignity, she no longer lets just anyone enter it. She no longer opens a door out of fear, nor gives up space out of habit, nor dims her light to please. She chooses from peace, not urgency. She shows herself whole without hiding her emotions, but also without using them as a shield. And in that emotional integrity, she finds a strength that needs no explanation, the strength of one who belongs to herself. Belonging to oneself is the result of having walked inward, of having seen oneself in both light and shadow, of having felt the echo of all the versions one has been, of having cried for what was left behind and smiled for what was found within. It is looking at life from a quieter, wiser, deeper place, not because everything is resolved, but because there is no longer a rush to resolve it, because the temple is in order, because the soul has a home, because the body no longer flees from itself. In that belonging, the woman stops seeking outside what she has already found inside, and then the world changes. Not because the world has changed, but because she no longer views it from need, but from fullness. And that shows in her way of walking, speaking, deciding, loving, because one who has found herself hardly ever gets lost again. One of the most revolutionary acts in a woman's life does not happen on big stages, nor under spotlights. It is not a massive protest, nor a public declaration. It is something intimate, almost invisible to others, but deeply transformative. Learning to say no, a firm, calm, guilt-free no. A no that does not seek to offend or please, but simply to be faithful to oneself. A no that draws a line, sets a limit, honors inner truth. Because when a woman begins to say no to what does not resonate, what does not nourish her, what no longer has space in her life, she is affirming something deeper. I exist, and my existence has the right to defend itself. We live in a culture that has conditioned women to say yes, to please, to give in, to adapt. Since childhood, they are rewarded for being good, for not causing fuss, for being obedient, for being flexible, for not causing discomfort. They learn, without anyone openly saying it, that setting boundaries can cost love, that expressing refusal can translate into rejection. That is why many grow up with a vague feeling that their needs are secondary, that their desire must wait, that their discomfort is not severe enough to be named. Thus, the yes becomes a shield to avoid conflict, but also a prison where authenticity is lost. Saying no, then, is beginning to reclaim internal territory. It is remembering that personal peace is worth more than others' approval, that it is not selfishness, but honesty, that setting boundaries is not rejecting the other, but prioritizing mutual respect, that a relationship that demands self-betrayal is not a relationship. It is a power structure. And if someone is offended because you chose to guard your energy, they probably benefited from your lack of boundaries. Healthy boundaries are not walls or barriers. They are maps. They are signs indicating where yes is and where no is, where the other ends and I begin, what I am willing to tolerate and what I am not, what kind of relationships I want in my life and which no longer have a place. Setting boundaries is an act of clarity. It is knowing who you are and what you need to maintain balance. That is to say, this builds me up, this does not do me good. And holding that decision, even if it hurts, even if not everyone understands, even if it means farewells, in that process, many women face their own internal resistance. Because the fear of disappointing, being judged, being alone, does not disappear overnight. Sometimes the body trembles, the voice breaks, guilt appears disguised as doubt. But every no spoken with truth strengthens the inner muscle of identity. Every boundary set from self-love marks a before and after, because one no longer lives at the mercy of circumstances, but from an active, conscious, rooted position. That authentic no also has a sacred component. It is the moment a woman recognizes that not everything can be negotiable, that there are aspects of her being, her time, her body, her energy that are not available for others' consumption. That being accessible does not mean being invaded. That being generous does not imply self-abandonment. And that taking care of herself is not a luxury. It is a responsibility. In that sense, every time a woman says no, she is giving herself permission to exist fully. This kind of authenticity is not always well received, because it breaks the comfort of those used to a compliant version, because it destabilizes family, affective, and work structures sustained by the silence of those who stay quiet for harmony, because it forces others to review their own behavior. But that discomfort is not the problem. It is a sign that something is moving, that a truth is coming to light, and every truth that is freed, though it hurts at first, has the power to heal. No then becomes an affirmation of being, not as an act of constant opposition, but as a way of saying, here I am, this is who I am, this is what I need. I don't want this. I can't now. I don't agree. It does not do me good. It is not my path. Each of these phrases is a declaration of existence. It is a way to stop being what others expect and start being who one really is. And that authenticity, although at first it feels lonely, ends up attracting more coherent, more sincere, lighter relationships. Jacobo Grinberg offers a fascinating view to understand this process from a broader perspective. In his studies on consciousness, he stated that our perception of the world is shaped by a series of learned mental structures. These structures act as filters that make us interpret reality in very specific ways. According to Grinberg, these structures are not neutral. They've been formed by culture, education, religion, family, media, and one of the most powerful filters we carry is that of should. The should is that inner voice that tells us how we must behave to be accepted. It tells us we must smile, sacrifice, maintain harmony, avoid conflict, please. But that voice is not ours. It is a mental mold. And according to Grinberg, breaking that mold is not only possible but necessary to regain contact with internal reality. Because as long as our perception is hijacked by external mandates, we will not be able to clearly see what we really want. We will not know how to distinguish between what we were taught to desire and what we truly desire. Saying no, then, is also a way to break those mental molds. It is an act of deprogramming. Every time a woman dares to challenge a mandate, even with a minimal gesture, she is opening a space in her consciousness. She is questioning the structure that held her captive. She is modifying her perceptual field. She is beginning to see the world and see herself from another place, more authentic, freer, more real. For Grinberg, this kind of break is essential for the expansion of consciousness, because when we stop automatically responding to what is expected, we begin to create a reality more coherent with our deep being. We become authors of our experience. We stop being the result of collective programming and begin to be a unique expression of consciousness. And that is, perhaps, true freedom. Not living as we're supposed to live, but as we really feel we want to. This change is not immediate. It requires training, patience, compassion. But every small act of authenticity is a step. Every no said with love is a victory. Every boundary held without guilt is a sign of maturity. Because the power of authenticity is not in shouting who you are, but in holding on to who you are even if no one applauds. Even if it hurts. Even if it means starting over. Because what you build from truth never collapses. It may wobble. It may transform. But it will always be yours. And that internal belonging is what allows living without fear of disappointing, without needing to hide, without seeking constant approval. Because when a woman has learned to inhabit herself from authenticity, she no longer trades her peace for anything. She no longer abandons herself for love. She no longer betrays herself to avoid conflict. She no longer gets lost in what others expect. She finds herself in what she chooses. And that choice, repeated every day in every detail, is what turns her life into a sacred expression of freedom. In a world that constantly invites disguise, adaptation, fitting in, being authentic is a revolution. Saying no is a political act. Setting boundaries is a ritual of protection. And living from truth is a way of creating a new reality. one where love does not demand sacrifice, where freedom is not loneliness, where identity is not defined by external validation. An authentic woman does not have to be perfect. She only has to be herself. And when she is, she changes the energy of everything around her, not because she imposes her presence, but because her presence alone inspires. Because there is an undeniable strength in one who has stopped lying to herself, in one who has learned to hold her word, in one who has found inside the permission the world never gave. And thus, little by little, with every no born from respect, with every boundary that protects the soul, with every act of internal coherence, a different life is woven, not always easy, but always true. A life no longer measured by how much it adapts, but by how much it inhabits itself. A life that does not need to ask permission, because it has already given itself its own. Speaking of individuation is speaking of freedom, but not freedom measured in miles, contracts, or external breakups, but a quieter, deeper, more radical freedom, that of being oneself. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human soul, defined individuation as the process by which a person becomes what they are, differentiating from the masses, disidentifying from imposed roles, recognizing their shadows, integrating their parts, and inhabiting their most intimate truth with total responsibility. It is not a destination, but a journey, a path back home that, paradoxically, begins when one dares to step off the path laid out by others. In the case of the woman, individuation involves deactivating an entire symbolic framework that has taught her to see herself through others' eyes. She has been educated to please, to care, to serve, to accompany, rarely to listen to herself, to assert herself, or to prioritize herself. And that is why the journey toward herself is not a stroll, but a dismantling, a brave process of dismantling beliefs, questioning mandates, gently disobeying everything that does not align with her essence. Jung said that individuation occurs when the soul stops obeying the mask, the social persona, and begins to respond to the self, that invisible and powerful center that guides us from within. Jacobo Grinberg, from a different but convergent perspective, spoke of consciousness as a field of personal and collective reality. For him, our perception is filtered by a matrix of beliefs, and only when that matrix is purified can we access the expanded reality of being. What Jung called the process of individuation, Grinberg understood as a liberation from mental filters that keep us trapped in a borrowed identity. Both, from different angles, invite us to look inward, to break the illusions of culture, and to create a life with meaning from the deepest self. In that imaginary dialogue between Jung and Grinberg, we find a clear invitation. Knowing yourself is not a luxury, it is an evolutionary necessity. And for the woman who has lived under others' gaze, beginning to look at herself is not only an act of self-love, it is a revolutionary act. It is declaring that her life will no longer be a response to the outside, but an expression from within, and that, more than empowerment, is liberation. That liberation begins when a woman stops looking outside for what she can only find inside, when she understands that no love, however perfect it seems, can fill the void left by disconnection from her own being, when she recognizes that it is not the lack of a partner that hurts, but the lack of connection with her soul. And as long as she keeps believing she needs another to feel complete, she will keep perpetuating a life of emotional dependence, of unbalanced bonds, of choices motivated by fear, not desire. The woman who has begun her individuation process no longer relates from lack, but from abundance. She does not look for someone to save her, to distract her, or to hold her instead of holding herself. She does not need someone to fill her, because she no longer feels empty. She does not chase, beg, or settle, because she has learned that the most important relationship in her life is the one she has with herself, that her peace is sacred, that her time is valuable, that her energy is not available for those who do not know how to respect it, and not out of pride, nor superiority, nor trauma, but out of awareness. Because she no longer confuses company with connection, attention with love, validation with worth. She has refined her sensitivity. She has learned to read the body signals, listen to internal alerts, stop before surrendering to a place where she cannot flourish. Her intuition is no longer a weak whisper. It is a firm guide. And although she can still stumble, she no longer abandons herself. She no longer betrays her truth for fear of being alone. This kind of woman is not indifferent to love. On the contrary, she honors it deeply, but she no longer idealizes it, nor sacrifices everything to attain it. She has understood that the most authentic love does not arise from need, but from choice. And choosing is a conscious act. It requires presence, clarity, maturity. It requires knowing who I am, what I want, what I can offer, and what I am unwilling to tolerate. It requires effective responsibility, both toward the other and toward oneself. Being enough does not mean closing oneself off from the world, but stopping to beg for affection. It means knowing that I am worthy of love just as I am, that I don't have to prove anything, hide anything, or constantly correct myself to fit in. It means living from a stable center, from an identity built on self-respect. And from there, if love comes, it is received with gratitude. But if it does not come, there is no tragedy. Because life's meaning no longer revolves around another, but around oneself. Because love is no longer a lifeline, it is a shared experience, not an anchor. This way of loving is neither cold nor distant. It is free. And in that freedom blooms the most beautiful aspect of connection. The possibility to grow together without losing oneself, to accompany without binding, to walk side by side without carrying the other. The woman who has integrated her real self, who has traversed her shadow, who has left behind imposed mental and affective molds, becomes someone who loves from fullness, not urgency. And that love, when it comes, has a different quality. It is quieter, deeper, more real. But even if it doesn't come, even if life does not bring a romantic bond like in the movies, there is no drama. Because life is full of other forms of love. Sincere friendship, connection with nature, expressed creativity, bodily pleasure, the beauty of being alive, moment of peace at dawn, the joy of choosing what nourishes you. The individuated woman knows that love is not only in a man, nor in a story, nor in a promise. Love is in the way one speaks, cares, holds, and reunites with oneself every time one gets lost. Carl Jung said that the goal of life is not perfection, but wholeness. And that wholeness includes a capacity to be alone without feeling lack, to be accompanied without losing oneself, to inhabit contradiction without despairing. It is knowing that life will not always be coherent, but that internal coherence can sustain us even amid chaos. It is knowing there will be moments of doubt, but that the inner compass always points north again, and that, although the path is not straight, as long as we are connected to our being, we are advancing towards something true. Jacobo Grinberg complements this vision when he states that reality transforms when consciousness transforms, that it is not the world that must change for us to be happy, but our internal structure. That peace is not found in having everything solved, but in living from a state of deep connection with the present, with truth, with mystery. In this sense, individuation is not only a psychological process, it is a spiritual awakening. It is stepping out of the collective script to write one's own story. It is ceasing to be a piece in a system to become a conscious being in evolution. And that evolution, though personal, has a collective impact. Because every woman who frees herself, who finds herself, who inhabits herself, is opening a path for others. She is deprogramming the ancestral mandate of dependence, challenging the narrative of love as salvation, sowing a new way of being in the world, a way where inner freedom is not selfishness, but service, because by freeing herself, she inspires, because by healing, she transforms, because by living her truth, she reminds others they can too. Thus, individuation ceases to be only an internal process and becomes an act of love for the world, a silent but powerful act, a daily but sacred act, an act that says, I did not come into this world to fit a mold. I came to discover who I am and to live from there with all the truth that dwells in me. By now on this journey, we have crossed many landscapes of the feminine soul. We have spoken of myths and mandates, imposed silences and conscious choices, projected shadows and truths that emerge powerfully. We have looked directly at that image, so loaded with prejudice that is the woman who lives alone. And now, at the end of this journey, it is worth pausing and asking with an open heart, who is really that woman? The woman who lives alone is not a broken figure, nor a victim, nor a social error. She is not a consequence of modern loneliness, nor an unfinished story, nor a character waiting to be saved. She is not an inaccessible being, nor an isolated exception, nor a symbol of emotional failure. She is, on the contrary, a woman who has begun to answer herself, who has stopped living to please, and has begun living to inhabit herself, who has understood that her value is not measured by the company she keeps, but by the connection she holds with her own soul. She is not defined by what she lacks, but by what she has chosen to leave out, not by what she has lost, but by what she has allowed herself to gain by reuniting with herself, not by the love she awaits, but by the love she already cultivates in her own hands, her own skin, her own center. She lives alone, yes, but not empty, not incomplete, not sad. She lives in dialogue with her inner world, in contact with her truth, in coherence with her intuition. She is a woman who has cried, who has doubted, who has fallen and risen, who has held bonds that did not nourish her, who has given more than she had, who has kept silent out of fear, and who has learned, sometimes painfully, that her voice deserves to be heard, even if it trembles, that her desire deserves to be attended to, even if it does not fit, that her body deserves respect, even if that means staying alone for a while. And she has discovered that being alone is not an abyss, but a door, not the end of something, but the beginning of everything. She no longer chases herself, no longer justifies herself, no longer denies herself, no longer twists herself to fit the shape the world expects, because she has understood that she did not come to fulfill others' expectations, but to be an authentic channel of life. She does not seek to please, she seeks to be. She does not run after loves that ignore her, nor kneel before romantic ideals that exhaust her. She chooses herself. She sustains herself. She cares for herself. She loves herself. And not because she thinks she is superior, not because she has given up on love, but because, finally, she has placed herself at the center of her life, because she has stopped begging for affection in places where nothing blooms, because she has understood that love that does not begin within herself can never sustain her, because she knows that when someone arrives, if they do, it will be to add, not to repair, to share, not to fill, to dance, not to hold her down. This woman is not alone because no one chose her. She is alone because for the first time, she chose herself, because she understood that her own company is not a punishment, but a privilege, because every silence of hers is a sacred space where something is ordered, because every sunset alone reminds her that she is alive, complete, present, because every calm day is a form of reconciliation with life, because every decision she makes from truth is a seed she plants for herself and, unknowingly, for others too, because, yes, the woman who lives alone is a symbol, not of emptiness, not of isolation, but of a new femininity that no longer depends on outdated structures to validate itself, of a way of inhabiting the world that asks for neither permission nor forgiveness, of a consciousness awakened from the spell of emotional dependence, and that has begun to design its own life, of an energy that, far from disappearing, becomes stronger, clearer, more honest. She is a reflection of many who come after, of many who still dare not, of many who begin to sense that another path is possible. And the beautiful thing about all this is that this woman is not a distant character. She is not a mythical figure. She is real. She is among us. She may be your neighbor, your sister, your friend, or she may be you. Perhaps you didn't know it until now. Perhaps you are still in process. Perhaps it still hurts. Perhaps you still doubt. But if at any point in this video you felt we were speaking about you, then you have already taken the first step, because recognizing yourself is the beginning of everything. And from here, there's only one thing left to say to you. You are not alone, even if you live alone, even if sometimes you are not understood, even if sometimes the noise of others' voices invades you. You are not alone, because there are many more like you, silently weaving new ways of being a woman, walking firmly despite judgment, loving without fear, even if that means first loving yourself, patiently building lives that are more authentic, more complete, more at peace. So if you have made it this far, I want to ask you something. I want you to be an active part of this awakening, to share this message with another woman who needs it, to carry it as a seed, as a mirror, as an embrace, to be that voice you once lacked, because your experience, your process, your truth can be the impulse someone else needs to take their step. And if you've already taken it, then become a beacon, an inspiration, a living memory that it is possible to live from integrity. And if anything you heard resonated with you, if any phrase touched your heart, if you felt this content put words to what you silently felt, then leave your mark down below. I want to read you. I want to know what this video awakened in you. I want us to keep expanding this message together. So if you recognize yourself in this story, if you ever chose your peace over empty company, if you dare to say no when everyone expected a yes, leave it in the comments. And if you want to receive a special greeting in the next video, write the word sacred. Because that is what you are. Because that is what we are. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening with an open heart. Thank you for allowing yourself to look beyond judgment, beyond myth, beyond fear. This was not just a video. It was an act of memory, of truth, and of possibility. I hope we keep meeting in these spaces where the real has a place, where profound has a voice, where the invisible begins to shine. See you at the next meeting. Until then, may your path be guided by your truth, your light, and by the most important love of all, the one born within you.